We are about to do a job in Italy, and I would like to introduce you all to each other.
Welcome to episode 5 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where we put two films together to create something far greater than the sum of its parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we return to Italy for two rather unusual entries in the Italian Giallo. First up, we have The House with Laughing Windows from 1976, directed by Pupi Avati, in which an art restorer gets caught up in a mystery while attempting to restore a sinister fresco in a country church. Then we travel backwards a few years to 1972 for Don't Torture a Duckling, a politically charged giallo from director Lucio Fulci, the so-called godfather of gore, in which a journalist tries to solve a series of child murders in a small rural town in the south of the country. Both of this week's films eschew the cosmopolitan locations, glamour and stylization most typically associated with the giallo. There's no fashionable jet set, nor are there any black glove killers stalking high-rises, art galleries, or brilliant white apartments. These are rural gialli, steeped in folk superstition, moral decay, and a deep suspicion of outsiders. And both films, in their own ways, serve as cinematic bookends to a tumultuous period in post-war Italy, years that were marked by broken trust, economic migration, religious anxiety, and the slow and painful splintering of the rural south from the industrialized north. And as in previous shows, I'm going to begin by discussing the historical context that made the films possible. Before I do that though, I just want to acknowledge the sources and references that I've used for research. Sources for the segment on The House with Laughing Windows include the 2012 Shameless DVD interview with director Pupi Avati, the book Italian Gothic and Horror Films 1970 to 1979 by Roberto Curti, the Palgrave Handbook of Contemporary Gothic, edited by Clive Bloom, and Milking the Moon, a Southerner's story of life on this planet by Eugene Walter. I've also referred to a brilliant article by Alexandra Helen Nicholas from 2014, which is entitled A Brutal Nobility, Painting Death in the House with Laughing Windows, and that was published in the Bright Lights Film Journal. All of those will, of course, be listed in the show notes. And for the discussion on Don't Torture a Duckling, I've referred to a number of books, including So Deadly, So Perverse, Volume 1 by Troy Howarth, Beyond Terror, The Films of Lucio Fulci by Stephen Thrower, and La Dolce Morte, Vernacular Cinema and the Italian Giallo Film by Mikhail J. Koven. I've also referred to a number of special features on the Arrow Video Blu-ray release, including commentaries by Troy Howarth and Mikhail J. Koven, and interviews with Barbara Boucher, Florinda Balkan, and Lucio Fulci. And again, these will all be listed in the show notes. To really understand the changes that Italy underwent after the Second World War and the subtext of both films, I think it's important to go back ever so slightly to the tail end of the conflict. After Mussolini was deposed in 1943, German forces quickly moved into the country in a proactive measure to prevent Italy from fully siding with the Allies. The Nazis moved swiftly, occupying large areas of the country and turning many rural and mountainous regions into battlefields. Many villages witnessed brutal reprisals from the German forces, with entire communities punished for supporting the partisans. At the same time, the Nazis reinstalled Mussolini as the leader of a puppet government in the north of the country, which was known as the Italian Social Republic. When the war ended in 1945, all of these wounds were still very raw. In the north, especially in smaller communities where German troops had been stationed, there was often a complex mixture of shame, silence, and simmering resentment. Some communities had collaborated, others had resisted, but in both, memories still lingered. Buildings damaged by shelling or occupation often stood unrepaired for years, and people also remembered exactly who had done exactly what. In some areas, acts of retribution occurred almost immediately, accusations of collaboration, summary justice, and even lynchings. Others simply closed ranks and refused to speak of it at all. This unresolved tension fed into a wider post-war atmosphere of suspicion and secrecy, especially in isolated communities where the past had not been buried, it was merely hiding under the surface. And it's definitely worth remembering that when we talk about the House with Laughing Windows in a few moments. Then, almost as soon as the guns fell silent, another transformation began. Between the 1950s and the 1970s, Italy experienced mass internal migration. It's estimated that more than 4 million people left their homes in the rural south and travelled northwards to the industrial cities of Milan, Turin, and Genoa, with entire families relocating in search of steady work and a better life. And this wasn't just a shift from south to north. It was a movement from the old world and into the new. Italy, in the early 1950s, was still, in large part, a society of agriculture, accounting for 42% of the population. By 1971, that number had dropped to around 20%. As industry boomed in the north, much of rural Italy, especially in the south, was left behind. Villages emptied, small towns shrank, and in some cases, entire communities were abandoned. This exodus left behind a stark demographic imbalance, aging populations, shuttered schools, and declining local economies that had once been held together by agriculture and community life. While the northern cities swelled, many of the places left behind began to feel more like repositories of the past, and that past was not always benign. It was often steeped in tradition, in superstition, and in rigid social structures. In these areas, the Catholic Church remained a dominant presence, and a belief in folk cures, the evil eye, and other forms of local magic persisted long after they had vanished from the urban landscape. For many of those who left, the village became a site of discomfort rather than one of nostalgia. The silence, the surveillance, the deeply embedded codes of conduct, all of it could feel alienating, even hostile, to those who had grown used to life in the city. And for those who remained, change itself was often viewed with suspicion. Outsiders, journalists, artists, and investigators could be seen as threats, not just to the local order, but to a worldview that had remained intact for centuries. At the same time, another significant change was happening, which was in Italian cinema. During the 1930s and the 1940s, films depicted a very carefully curated version of Italian life under Mussolini. These have become known as the Telefoni Bianchi films, or white telephone cinema, and were a dominant force in Italy through the 1930s and the early 1940s. Essentially aspirational melodramas and romantic comedies, they were named after the stylish white telephones that appeared in nearly every upper middle class drawing room, and these were used to signify modernity and refinement. These films presented an Italy of perfect manners, upward mobility, and sparkling Art Deco interiors. No poverty, no politics, no unpleasantness, just love triangles, light misunderstandings, and a safe return to social order by the third act. The plots were feather light, the settings immaculate, and the politics, if you could call them that, were utterly domesticated. Whilst not being outright fascist propaganda, the message was clear. Under Mussolini, Italy was prosperous, orderly, and modern, and absolutely everything was under control. Perhaps unsurprisingly, after the war, the genre collapsed under the weight of its own irrelevance. The disconnect between its sparkling surfaces and Italy's bombed-out cities was far too stark to ignore. In its place came neo-realism, a radical shift in both style and substance. Films like Rome, Open City, and Bicycle Thieves swapped the studios for real streets, actors for non-professionals, and fantasy for social truth. But by the late 1950s, even neorealism began to fade and was replaced by something more volatile, the Filone. The Filone was a production model and was based on capitalizing on whatever was working at the box office. It wasn't a genre, it was a money-making strategy. If a Western was a big hit, then the studios made 10 more. If a giallo drew in audiences, production companies raced to make another 90. It's this strategy which gives us the film Night Train Murders, and also The House at the Edge of the Park, both of which followed the success of Wes Craven's Last House on the Left in 1972. The strategy has also given us any number of shark movies, which followed the success of Jaws in 1975. Italy also had a swathe of sword and sandal epics that were known as peplum, sci-fi extravaganzas in the wake of Star Wars, endless sex comedies, and police crime thrillers polizioteschi, as well as, of course, the giallo. What is interesting, though, is that, whilst, as discussed a few weeks ago, the giallo might owe much to American noir thrillers and people like Hitchcock, as well as the German crimi movies, it also depicts a very odd inversion of the Telefoni Bianchi films. It's a fascination with stylish interiors, attractive bourgeois lives, and surface perfection which hides something rotten underneath. Only the giallo inserts a healthy amount of murder and mayhem on top, just for good measure. But not all gialli are focused on the violent death of the privileged bourgeoisie, with some using their mystery trappings to explore other, darker and more deeper themes. All of which brings us to this week's films, and fair warning for both films, I'm going to spoil these very early on, so if you haven't seen them, it's best to proceed with caution, or indeed press pause and come back later. Our first movie is The House with Laughing Windows. This was released in 1976 and was directed by Pupi Avati from a script by Pupi Avati, as well as his brother Antonio Avati and Gianni Cavina. It stars Lino Cappuccio, Francesco Marciano, Gianni Cavina, and Eugene Walter. Pupi Avati was born Giuseppe Avati in Bologna in 1938 and was evacuated to the countryside during the Second World War. Like many filmmakers of his generation, cinema became an early escape, a portal out of the trauma and deprivation of post-war life. Coming out of the war, he had known both hunger and fear, and the movies offered an alternative, a world of colour, order, and resolution. He said that as a child, he loved films that delivered happy endings, the kind that closed with a caption saying the end and a couple walking off into the sunset. For young Avati, cinema wasn't art, it was escapism, and that was more than enough. After school, he studied political science at the University of Florence, and then, rather unexpectedly, went to work in the frozen food business. But around the same time, he developed a love of jazz and became a proficient clarinetist. Although he initially wanted to pursue music professionally, he came to believe that he didn't have the talent to really make it. But everything changed when he saw Fellini's 8.5 and realised that cinema could be more than just an escape, it could be self-expression. That film, he says, made him want to become a director. And interestingly, he later cast the American Eugene Walter, who had played a journalist in 8.5, in the small but important role of the priest in The House with Laughing Windows. And there'll be a lot more on Eugene Walter a little bit later on. Avati is often described as a director who defies easy categorization. While he has made several horror films, he doesn't identify with the genre and has said on multiple occasions that he finds most Italian horror, with a few exceptions, to be overrated and that he has very little knowledge of it. His work spans a wide range of genre, including historical drama, jazz-infused comedies, buddy films, biopics, and the occasional foray into the macabre. Over his career, he's received numerous accolades, including nominations for the Palme d'Or, Silver Ribbons, and David di Donatello Awards. He's actually won 3 David di Donatello Awards and 5 silver ribbons, and in 1995 he also became president of the Federico Fellini Foundation. In 2008 he published his autobiography, and he's also written 3 novels. In an interview included on the Shameless DVD release of The House with Laughing Windows, he explains that one reason for his prolific output is that he works in total ignorance of cinematic trends. He says he doesn't know what's fashionable or what others are writing, and he prefers it that way. So, although this film has come to be grouped under the banner of the Giallo, he insists that wasn't his intention. That said, he has cited Dario Argento's The Bird with the Crystal Plumage as a film he admired, and he also briefly worked on the screenplay for Argento's 1975 movie Deep Red, though he left the project after just 2 days, citing, quote, "a few problems," end quote. The origin of this week's film is rooted far more in crisis and an ability to pivot than they are in calculation. Just before production, Avati had directed a film called Bordella, also known as The House of Pleasure for Women, and he was accused of obscenity. Avati and his crew were confident that they would be acquitted. They even bought a bottle of champagne in the car on the way to the courthouse in preparation to celebrate. But instead, they were found guilty and the film was impounded. Suddenly, it looked like their careers were in jeopardy. Uncertain of what to do next, he turned to a script that he had already written. This was a more personal project, inspired by memories and incidents from his childhood. Convinced that it could be made inexpensively and with a small crew, he managed to secure funding of 150 million lira, which is roughly $170,000, and he assembled a skeletal team of just 12 people. Working within such constraints forced him to strip things back. As he later reflected, the modest scale of the production gave him the opportunity to reconnect with the technical craft of filmmaking, to get closer to the camera, and to refine his directorial instincts. The result is a haunting, slow-burn horror that has only grown in reputation over time. Despite its troubled beginnings, the film is now considered a key work in Italian horror, precisely because of the precision and the restraint that it shows. The lead character in the film is Stefano, an art restorer who is invited to a small remote village to restore a damaged fresco in the local church. He is played by Lino Cappuccio, a name that Giallo fans will also recognise from his performance in the film The Bloodstained Shadow from 1978. Cappuccio, who sadly passed away in May 2022, was not just an actor, he was also a screenwriter and a director. He began his career in television, breaking into cinema with an uncredited appearance in Franco Zeffirelli's The Taming of the Shrew in 1967. Over the course of his career, he appeared in more than 70 films, and he earned a special David di Donatello Award in 1970. In the film, Stefano is framed quite deliberately as an everyman, something that Avati saw as essential to the Gothic tradition. As he put it, quote, "The spectator must be able to identify with the protagonist, who must be a perfectly average person." End quote. This creative choice, however, is actually one that's divided audiences. Stefano's ordinariness, his quiet, almost passive nature, is rather unusual for a central character in a giallo narrative, and for audiences who are more used to the suave flash of actors like George Hilton or Jean Sorel. Surrounded by grotesques, characters who frankly wouldn't feel out of place in a Fellini film, Stefano can feel somewhat colourless by contrast. For some modern viewers, this makes him harder to root for, even as the story grows increasingly bizarre and macabre. For the small but important role of the priest, Avati cast the quite remarkable Eugene Walter, an American who, as I mentioned earlier, had already appeared in Fellini's 8.5 as a journalist, and who will also be familiar to Giallo fans for his roles in the films The Black Belly of the Tarantula in 1971 and The Pajama Girl Case in 1978. Born in 1921 and passing away in 1998, Walter lived an extraordinary life that frankly could fill a whole episode all on its own. Often referred to as Truman Capote, but without the fame, He was an actor, a poet, a puppeteer, a gourmet chef, a cryptographer, an editor, a costume designer, a translator, and a well-known raconteur. His memoir, Milking the Moon, A Southerner's Story of Life on This Planet, is full of wit, acid observations, and astonishing anecdotes, making it clear that the Truman Capote comparisons are not without merit. Walter had previously worked with Capoliccio on the 1969 film Normal Young Man, and the experience, as he recalled in his memoir, was not particularly enjoyable. In his words, quote, "He was impossible to work with. He just mumbles the lines, and none of the other actors can get their cues. He said it has to be natural, and I said, Lino, I've worked with a great many actors in theatre and on the screen. The more natural they look, the more you can be sure they've rehearsed. He's just one of those actors who's living the part. Oh, so sensitive, you know. They are the people who fall apart if anything goes wrong. I like people who rehearse and who are professional." End quote. To be fair, Walter didn't have any negative comments about Capoliccio or their work together on The House with Laughing Windows, but he did have a few colourful memories of the production itself, and more on that in a few moments. Although the film is often classified as a giallo, this label actually feels somewhat disingenuous. The film's tone, pacing, and restrained bursts of violence make it a far more subdued affair than audiences might expect from the genre, especially when compared to the flamboyant, blood-soaked gialli of the early 1970s, which is often considered the movement's golden era. Avati himself has referred to the film as a gothic horror, and with its decaying manor house, fog-drenched streets, billowing curtains, and ominous creaking doors, it arguably has more in common with Mario Bava's early gothic work than with Dario Argento's sleek, leather-gloved killers. To be clear, I'm not arguing that the film isn't a giallo. It is, after all, a mystery film, but I do think it's worth briefly looking at the hallmarks of Gothic literature, because they seem particularly fitting here. Gothic fiction is typically marked by an atmosphere of fear, the threat or suggestion of the supernatural, and crucially, the intrusion of the past into the present. Unlike fairy tales or straightforward ghost stories, the Gothic is defined by a sense of lingering decay, the present haunted, not just metaphorically, but often physically, by what came before. In Gothic literature, settings are essential: crumbling buildings, ruined churches, convents, crypts, all functioning as a grim reminder of a once flourishing world, now in decline. Gothic atmosphere is, of course, usually claustrophobic. Common plot elements include persecution, imprisonment, madness, and murder. And structurally, Gothic fiction often embraces the fragmented. There are stories within stories, changing narrators, and old letters or diaries that reveal long-buried truths and blurred family ties. If you've seen the film, you will know that much of this applies directly to The House with Laughing Windows. Replace the Gothic castle with the crumbling villa where Stefano is sent after being ejected from the hotel, and you have the classic Gothic setting. Add in the sense of an inescapable past slowly pressing in on the present, and you're firmly in the realm of the Gothic. Avati has made it clear that he had no interest in emphasizing violence, and has spoken with some distaste about the relentless close-ups of wounds and slashing blades that typified many of the gialli that came before. In this film, despite the rather graphic opening credit sequence, the murders, when they finally arrive, are not drawn-out exercises in spectacle. They're shocking, sudden, and unsettling, but they're never gratuitous. What truly gives this film its lingering impact is the atmosphere of dread that quietly builds up across its runtime, a sense of unease that creeps in slowly and never quite releases its grip. This is greatly enhanced by the choice of location. The village here is not some picturesque Italian idyll. It's dusty, stagnant, and incredibly uninviting. Despite the mayor's ambitions to turn it into a tourist destination, the town has only 4 supposed attractions. There's the damaged fresco, the thermal waters, the local women, and what's laughably described as the peace and quiet, a claim that is undercut almost immediately by a barroom brawl in the town's only restaurant. The local police chief, more grounded in reality than the mayor, advises Stefano to leave, saying, quote, "This is no place for young people. They all leave, and they're right. There's no work, no entertainment, only wine." End quote. The countryside here is not romanticised. It's barren and decaying. We're shown collapsing barns, rusting equipment, and the skeletal remains of a once thriving agricultural life. Elsewhere, nature has taken back control. The land is overgrown, strangled by vines and weeds, particularly around the abandoned manor house where Stefano ends up staying, and the eponymous house with laughing windows in the marshes. Even the local water is poisoned. Biologist Mazza, himself recovering from a nervous breakdown, concludes that the local rivers have been contaminated as a result of rusting wartime equipment abandoned by the Nazis in the marshes. "There'll be no more eels in this water," he declares grimly, although this is contradicted by the priest in a scene just a few moments later, giving a lie to Mazza's supposed expertise. The cinematography in the film reflects this desolation. The colours are deliberately muted, and the effect is one of lifelessness. Nothing flourishes in this soil. It produces only decay, and quite literally, the bones of the past. The lingering trauma of war also permeates the film, not just in these references to environmental collapse, but in the decision to set the story in the early 1950s. The villagers are wary and evasive and are unwilling to talk about the past. And while this silence, of course, serves the needs of the mystery, it also reflects something far deeper and something we discussed earlier, the legacy of the town's possible collaboration with the Nazis. One telling line comes from the hotel maid, who says that the only tourists the area has ever seen were, quote, "those German bastards from the 1940s. End quote. The church that houses the fresco was once a hiding place for the SS, and it's been suggested that the artist Bruno Legnani, who we encounter in flashbacks as the town's dark past begins to unravel, was named to deliberately echo Antonio Legnani, a real-life figure and wartime celebrity who was a vocal supporter of Mussolini and the fascist regime. Antonio Legnani eventually became Secretary of State for the Italian Social Republic before dying in a car crash in 1943. The character of Legnani is also thought to be partially inspired by the Italian primitive painter Antonio Ligabue. And I'm going to take a moment here to talk about Ligabue, not just because it's a fascinating story, but also as his name is directly invoked by the character of the mayor when Stefano first arrives in the village. He speaks of the town producing its own Ligabue, its own tortured genius, a homegrown artist whose notoriety might draw attention and, ideally, tourism. Ligabue has been described as a visionary master of naive art, and he certainly fits the archetype of the suffering outsider artist. He struggled with mental illness throughout his life and used his art, often raw, often disturbing, as a form of communication, catharsis, and survival. Born in Switzerland in 1899, Ligabue's life began in turmoil. At just 9 months old, he was fostered out to a Swiss family. Ligabue never knew his father, but blamed him for his mother's death, as his mother and 3 of his brothers died in 1913, though this was apparently of food poisoning. This bitterness probably prompted him to change his given surname from Lacabue to Ligabue. As a young man, he drifted through a life of poverty and labour, taking occasional work as a farmhand and living largely on the fringes. Following a dispute with his foster mother, he was committed to a psychiatric clinic, and in a move that speaks volumes, he was then expelled from Switzerland altogether, and despite speaking no Italian, was deported to Italy and the birthplace of his foster father. In Italy, Ligabue lived with support from a city hospice. He began painting in the 1920s, and by 1928 he had met the sculptor Renato Marino Mazzacurati, who recognised his talent and encouraged him to work in oils. From there, Ligabue wandered the banks of the River Po, painting obsessively, a solitary figure adrift in the landscape. His life was punctuated by hospitalization, including a long spell in a psychiatric asylum after an episode of self-harm in 1937. During the Second World War, he was conscripted into the Italian army and served as an interpreter for German troops. But after an altercation in which he attacked a Nazi soldier with a bottle, he was again institutionalized, this time for 3 years. In the post-war years, Ligabue's work began to attract critical attention. He painted with growing intensity, and by the late 1950s, journalists and art dealers began to seek him out. His first solo exhibition was held in Rome in 1961, but sadly the following year he suffered a motorcycle accident, and not long after was paralysed. Suffering from ill health, he was baptised into the Catholic Church and died shortly thereafter in 1965. I'll be linking to some of his work on our Instagram, but for now I want to quote briefly from an article on the Artist blog, which perfectly captures the quality of his self-portraiture. Quote, "His self-portraits reveal a human condition of anguish, desolation, and bewilderment. His face expresses pain, fatigue, and dismay, and every relationship with the world seems to have been severed forever." End quote. And this is precisely the tone that we see echoed in The House with Laughing Windows. Ligabue's influence seems to run through the film, not only in the story of the disturbed artist, but visually in the fresco of Saint Sebastian as it is gradually revealed. There is a primitive brutality to it, a blending of innocence and torment. We also see similar work hanging in the home of a secondary character called Mr. Poppy, crude, expressive paintings that are steeped in pain, suffering, and psychological disturbance. There's a particularly telling flashback in which Legnani paints a self-portrait using a mirror, an image that seems directly drawn from Ligabue's own practice, as he was known to hang a mirror from his neck while painting, using it to study and distort his own face. Legnani's fresco of Saint Sebastian is the film's central image. It's the object around which the plot orbits, but it also functions as something deeper, a metaphor for the narrative itself. As the fresco is gradually restored and more of the image is brought into the light, so too are the secrets of the town, slowly and often unwillingly. It's a visual motif that mirrors the structure of the film, layers being peeled away and horror revealing itself bit by bit. The choice of Saint Sebastian is a particularly interesting one. The martyrdoms of the early saints were, as we know, often elaborate, imaginative exercises in brutality. Saint Bartholomew was flayed alive, Saint Lawrence was roasted on a grill, Saint Cassian was hacked to death by school children, and Saint Sebastian, famously, was tied to a tree and shot with arrows. The decision to centre the fresco on Saint Sebastian came from a vivid childhood memory. As a child, Avati attended a church decorated with an especially grisly depiction of the saint's martyrdom. Whilst most religious paintings present their subjects with a beatific serenity, even in death, the painting Avati remembers was different. It was, in his words, more like a horror movie. The painter had lavished attention on the wounds, the knives, the moment of pain. And though the saint's expression was meant to convey spiritual acceptance, Avati said the image disturbed him deeply. This, of course, carried through to The House with Laughing Windows. The fresco here, unlike the traditional depictions of Sebastian, does not feature a serene or holy face. Instead, the saint's face is contorted in agony, and his pain is unmistakable. It reflects not redemption, but madness. The madness of the painter Legnani, who is also described throughout the film as the painter of agonies. Just as a side note, for those interested in ecclesiastical trivia, Saint Sebastian did not, in fact, die from the arrows. He was found still alive by a woman later canonized as Saint Irene, who nursed him back to health. Unfortunately, after his recovery, he made the mistake of confronting the emperor again, and this time they didn't miss. He was clubbed to death, and his body was dumped into a Roman sewer. But that's not quite so picturesque. Returning to Avati's childhood, alongside the memory of that disturbing fresco, The other major influence on the film came from his wartime evacuation from Bologna to the countryside. There, living with aunts and distant relatives, he was subjected to a steady stream of folk tales, rural superstitions, and stories of religious miracles, all told with the express purpose of keeping the children in line. One story in particular stayed with him. It involved the exhumation of a local cemetery and the discovery that one of the buried priests had in fact been a woman. Avati doesn't give much more detail than that, but we do know, given the Catholic Church's long-standing position that women cannot be ordained, the idea of a female priest, especially in the conservative religious landscape of 1940s Italy, would have been considered not just scandalous, but sacrilegious. It's also worth noting that the myth of Pope Joan, the supposed female pope of the Middle Ages, was still circulating in some circles as a cautionary tale. To Avati's aunt, the woman priest became a figure of fear and was frequently used as a threat. Be good, or the woman priest will come for you. He remembers how she'd imitate the priest's voice, whispering, and the click of her heels on the stone floors. In the dark, crumbling rooms of the countryside house, every sound became a harbinger of her arrival. The woman priest, perhaps unsurprisingly, haunted his childhood. Years later, when he began writing scripts, he found that she had indeed never quite left him. In fact, he says that one of the very first stories he wrote, the seed that would eventually become this film, ended with the moment that this mysterious priest reveals herself. He wrote the whole story, he said, just to make sense of that ending, just to exorcise the fear. And so we reach the final act of The House with Laughing Windows, and the full horror of the story reveals itself. We learn that Legnani was not merely disturbed, he was, in fact, entirely insane. His madness, we're told, was brought on by untreated syphilis, which fueled an obsession with capturing death on canvas, specifically the precise moment of agony as life slips away. His two sisters, equally mad and also suffering from the same disease, enabled his obsession. Within the walls of the titular house, the two of them lured young men to their deaths, murdering them while Legnani painted their final moments. The fresco of St. Sebastian, we discover, was not an act of religious devotion, or indeed an artistic metaphor. It was painted from life. A real body, real wounds, and real suffering. The trio's crimes were not only sadistic, but they were also incestuous. Their relationship, as revealed by a surviving character, was both homicidal and also sexually entangled. Although the film hints that Legnani may still be alive, a suggestion which haunts much of the second half, this is ultimately a red herring. He is long dead, but his sisters have survived, and they're still operating in secret. One is disguised as a paraplegic woman, the very woman who hosts Stefano in her crumbling manor house, and the other is hiding in plain sight as the village priest. Their murdered brother's body is preserved in formaldehyde, and their ritual killings continue. They believe, or claim to believe, that through an obscure rite, a kind of sacrificial communion, they can bring their brother back, one death to restore another. The film's themes of transgression and identity blur further here, particularly around gender. Earlier in the film, we see a self-portrait of Legnani hanging in Mr. Poppy's house, a painting of the artist's own face, superimposed onto the reclining nude body of a woman. And then, of course, there's the casting of Eugene Walter as the unnamed priest, a choice that is rich with subtext. Walter had previously played, in drag, the Mother Superior in Fellini's film Juliet of the Spirits in 1965, and his casting here feels far from accidental. Walter himself discusses the role in his memoir, saying, quote, "I played a Brazilian lady who had come to Italy and disguised herself as a man, as a country priest. I was the little parish priest who was really a Brazilian lady crook. And in the last shot of the film, I rip off my priest garments and here are these tits. And I start singing this Portuguese fado, and I bring out this knife to kill him. That's the end of the film. And I will never forget sitting in this little country church at 6 a.m, naked to the waist, with 3 makeup artists gluing this wire and foam rubber thing on me. It took about an hour, because they really glued them on." End quote. And that's where the film leaves us, with death, delusion, and desecration, and a mystery that never entirely resolves. Now, when taken out of context, the film's climax might sound absurd. Eugene Walter's own comments certainly don't help in that regard. But somehow, The House with Laughing Windows makes it work. This is largely thanks to the slow, creeping dread that Avati has cultivated over the course of the film. By the time we reach this final revelation, we're so immersed in its atmosphere of decay and dread that the shift into outright insanity feels almost natural. The distortions in cinematography at the climax only enhance this. The church seems unnaturally vast. The camera lingers on Walter's face in a shimmering soft focus, and the entire scene is soaked in a nightmare logic. It's absurd, yes, but it's also deeply unsettling. What makes it all the more disturbing is the implication that the townspeople have always known. Just as some may have turned a blind eye to fascist atrocities during the war, the villagers here are not only aware of the horror, they are complicit in its continuation. When Stefano, wounded and bleeding, staggers through the streets calling for help, shutters close, doors remain shut. Nobody comes. This is a town which eats its outsiders. The young school teacher, Stefano's love interest, is sexually assaulted and murdered by a local man, even though the sisters had already marked her for death. Mazza, the biologist, uncovers too much and is thrown from a window to his death. And Stefano ends the film badly wounded, trapped in a desecrated church, utterly alone, as the sisters advance. And yet, just when you think all hope is lost, we are offered the faintest glimmer of salvation. Over the final shot, as the credits roll, we hear the sound of a police siren. The mayor, who, importantly, we learn is not originally from the town, and perhaps also feels some guilt at having brought both Mazza and Stefano into the horror, has phoned the police. Whether they will actually arrive in time is rather ambiguous, but the sound of the siren is there. The possibility of rescue is acknowledged. So perhaps Avati's childhood love of happy endings wasn't entirely forgotten. Avati has said that The House with Laughing Windows is a film in which he feels like a child hiding behind a curtain, waiting to leap out and scare his parents, who pretend to be frightened just to humour him. Despite having made over 40 films at the time of recording across virtually every genre imaginable, he says that whenever he gives a lecture or appears at a university, someone will inevitably bring him a DVD of The House with Laughing Windows to sign. It's the film that follows him, the one that people remember, the one that, for all its quiet horror, seems to linger longer than the others. We now move on to our second film in this week's double bill, with Don't Torture a Duckling from 1972. This was directed by Lucio Fulci and written by Lucio Fulci, Roberto Gianviti, and Gianfranco Clarici. It stars Thomas Milian, Barbara Boucher, Mark Perel, and Florinda Balkan. When I was growing up, back in the dark days before the internet, long before we could easily research directors online or watch fan-made videos on YouTube, we were entirely reliant on magazines and film books for our horror film information, and very often ended up reading about movies that we would otherwise be unable to experience, or so we thought at the time. This was, of course, the dark days before streaming services, but it was also the era of the video nasty, where many films, including many of Lucio Fulci's, were either banned outright or pretty much impossible to find. So, as a result, I read mostly about Fulci's movies long before I saw any of them, and as this turns out, this was incredibly ill-advised, not just because of the plethora of spoilers, but also for a slightly sadder reason. Whilst many writers of the time exalted the work of Argento and Mario Bava, Fulci was generally treated as a kind of poor relation, called quite unfairly a poor man's Argento, or else he was dismissed altogether, and often referred to as a talentless, gore-fueled hack. This, I feel, is a complete injustice. While I will freely admit that the gorier movies from the second half of his career, quite frankly, are not made for me, I recognise the talent and can still admire his artistry and creativity. And in hindsight, many of the comments that were written about him at the time feel unnecessarily cruel and somewhat supercilious. To my own regret, this reputation kept me from watching a lot of his films for many, many years. And that's a shame, because I enjoy his early Giallo films very much. Even the films in his Gates of Hell trilogy, whilst not being to my particular taste, are visually striking, and I greatly admire his creativity and his ability to create atmosphere. Of the 57 films that he directed, Fulci often said that Don't Torture a Duckling was his favourite, and I think it's his best film. But before we get into the movie itself, I'd like to spend a few moments discussing its creator. Lucio Fulci was born in Rome's Trastevere neighbourhood in 1927. He never knew his father, and his mother, Lucia, raised him alone. As he grew up, she had ambitions for him to become a lawyer, but Fulci had other ideas and enrolled in medical school. However, this was not to be. Following a relationship breakup, as his then girlfriend said he wasn't earning enough money, he dropped out of medical school and moved into the film world, thinking he could make more money and also have more fun in cinema. His journey into filmmaking started by joining Rome's renowned Centro Sperimentale Film School, and he started working on documentaries before building his way up to become an assistant director. At the same time, he also worked as a film critic and produced screenplays on the side. In the early 1950s, his career turned to comedy, and he started working under the guidance of the Italian comedy director Steno, helping out on films starring Totò, one of Italy's most beloved comedians. He eventually graduated to directing comedies himself, and then, under the Italian Filone system mentioned earlier, he started working in various genres, directing whatever was popular at the time: farces, thrillers, westerns, and also historical dramas. The most famous and controversial of these was the drama Beatrice Cenci in 1969, after which he found himself, and not for the last time, under fire for the film's excessive violence and criticism of the Catholic Church. Sadly, audiences stayed away from that one, but to my mind it's a very good film. It's available on both Shudder and YouTube, and if you're interested, I highly recommend it. In the same year, Fulci directed his first Giallo, one on top of the other, which is also known under the more exploitative title of Perversion Story. A very loose reworking of Hitchcock's Vertigo, the film was a success and set the stage for the gialli that would follow later. In 1971, he released Lizard in a Woman's Skin, a psychedelic giallo starring Florinda Balkan, Anita Strindberg and Jean Sorel, which had such convincing special effects that Fulci had to go to court to prove they were not real. This is a testament, of course, to the brilliance of special effects wizard Carlo Rambaldi. He followed this with this week's film, Don't Torture a Duckling, in 1972, which again led to accusations of him being anti-Catholic, and more on that later. These two films also found him earning the wrath, or possibly contempt, of Dario Argento, who, as we discussed a few weeks ago, was less than impressed by the plethora of animal-titled gialli that followed his hit The Bird with the Crystal Plumage. Despite the fact that Fulci had directed a giallo long before Argento's film had been released, the two fell out and would not make peace for many years. Fulci's final giallo in the 1970s was Seven Notes in Black, which is also known as The Psychic, and this starred Jennifer O'Neill as the titular clairvoyant, as is a film that Quentin Tarantino has called out as being a particular favourite. Throughout the 1970s, Fulci's style continued to evolve. He dipped into spaghetti westerns, crime thrillers, and eventually full-on horror. In 1979, his career hit a new level with Zombie, a film that was originally billed in Italy as a sequel to George A. Romero's Dawn of the Dead, even though Romero had nothing to do with it. Given that Dario Argento had produced the Romero film, this did very little to help the acrimony between them, but more on that later. Fulci's film, which was released as Zombie Flesh Eaters in the UK, is a rather different proposition to the George Romero movie, taking zombies out of the USA, for the most part, and staging the mayhem on a Caribbean island. Including a much-discussed zombie versus shark sequence, the film is outrageous, gory, and was an international sensation, though it, perhaps unsurprisingly, found itself on the UK video nasties list in the 1980s. The excesses of this film also led to his being dubbed the Godfather of Gore, a title he shared with American splatter pioneer Herschel Gordon Lewis. From there, his horror output became even more brutal and also increasingly more surreal, with his Gates of Hell trilogy, which included the films City of the Living Dead in 1980, The Beyond in 1981, and House by the Cemetery, also in 1981, all three of which starred Catriona MacColl. MacColl had initially taken the role in City of the Dead, as her agent had assured her that no one was actually going to see it. So it's rather ironic that these films are probably the work for which she is now best known, and have earned her a dedicated fan following and a place in the pantheon of Italian horror heroines. These films also very loosely reference H.P. Lovecraft, and are heavy on atmosphere, surreal imagery, and of course, excessive gore. Fulci's style was in full bloom, and the world took notice, particularly the UK, which promptly put all three on the video nasty list, alongside their predecessor. He followed this with his extremely violent giallo, The New York Ripper, which I am really not a fan of, and which proved far too controversial for its own good, again appearing on the video nasty list and creating a very negative response for perceived misogyny. However, health issues, including diabetes and a near-fatal bout of hepatitis, made things even harder for him, and he was forced into temporary retirement. On his subsequent return to directing, he found himself working with increasingly restricted budgets, very tight deadlines, and the quality of his output suffered greatly. Given that his medical needs had drained all of his finances, he basically couldn't say no when an opportunity presented itself, and therefore many of his later films came not out of creativity, but economic necessity. However, a lifeline was offered from the rather unlikely hand of Dario Argento. The two met in person at the 1994 Rome Fanta Festival, and Argento was greatly taken aback by Fulci's condition. Fulci was by now in very poor health and using a wheelchair. Their feud was forgotten, and it was proposed that Fulci would direct a horror film titled Wax Mask, with Argento producing. Unfortunately, Fulci passed away in 1996, before the project could be completed. In the years following his death, his legacy has grown, with his work finding new admirers in the age of Blu-ray special releases and streaming services. Shortly before his death, he had been able to attend a Fangoria event and was genuinely shocked to see such admiration for his films. But part of the tragedy of his life is that he did not live long enough to see the overwhelming resurgence of interest in his work. Whilst Argento has seen numerous retrospectives and exhibitions, and has experienced firsthand the impact of his films on generations of fans and writers and directors, Fulci sadly passed away before he could experience the same in relation to his own work, and so he never truly understood how beloved, admired, and inspirational his films are to many. In a life that was marred by personal tragedy and ill health, this would perhaps have been a candle in the darkness of his later years. And so now we move on to the film itself, and I said this at the top of the show, but I'm going to say it one more time. I'm going to spoil this one very early, and given it's a murder mystery, now is the time to hit pause if you want to play Whodunit. Don't Torture a Duckling was developed after Fulci's previous film, a satirical comedy, faced censorship issues, and so he decided to return to the genre he had already explored in One on Top of the Other and Lizard in a Woman's Skin. The film was officially announced to trade papers in March 1972 under the title Don't Torture Donald Duck, but this was very quickly changed, presumably after some legal issues from the Walt Disney Studio. When announced, the cast originally included Italian actor Ray Lovelock, who was a stalwart of exploitation cinema at the time, However, at some point between the announcement and the beginning of production, Lovelock was replaced by Mark Perrell. This decision allegedly led to some issues between Perrell and his co-star Thomas Millian, who plays the lead, who it is said hated each other to such a degree that their climactic fight sequence was less performance and more catharsis. Although it has been said that the early drafts of the script set the story in an industrial Turin neighbourhood, during rewrites the team decided to relocate the plot to a remote southern village to achieve firstly a less conventional giallo setting, but also to explore some deeper themes. These themes include the stark contrast between the more affluent north and rural south, an overwhelming belief in superstition and folk magic, fear and persecution of the outsider, and, most controversially of all, a Catholic Church that destroys youth in order to, quote-unquote, protect its innocence. The film was shot in the hills around Puglia and the Lazio countryside, using a village that would, incidentally, later be used for the film The Passion of the Christ. Fulci even filmed interiors in actual houses as opposed to studio sets, giving the film a much greater sense of realism. The film was shot with wide-angle compositions, with cinematographer Sergio Duffizi using Techniscope to create a sense of isolation while capturing the beauty of the Italian landscape. With much of the film set under a glaring summer sun, the cinematography also gives a stark clarity to every scene in the film, using amber and orange filters to enhance the sun-scorched feel of village life, something that was described by one critic as sun-bleached hyperrealism. However, despite the undeniable beauty of the landscape, the setting of Duckling is far from being a tourist destination. This is a poor community, and one which has been left behind, and possibly destroyed by progress. This is summed up beautifully by the opening shot, a wide-angle pan that shows a modern motorway bridge cutting its way through the countryside before panning to the witch, Machara, digging up the long-buried bones of a small child. Here modernity may be making inroads, no pun intended, but these superstitions are ever present and won't remain buried for long. The villagers live in the shadow of post-war reconstruction, but they receive no benefits from it, with a new road only serving to bring in sex workers, tourists who are literally passing to another destination, and the corruption of modernity, represented by Barbara Boucher and her character Patrizia. Patrizia is an ex-drug addict and the daughter of a local construction magnate who now lives in splendid modernity on the outskirts of town. The house was built by her father, quote, solely for the pleasure of showing off his accumulated riches to those who were once his fellow villagers. End quote. The character of Patrizia is a very troubling one, particularly for a modern audience. As a potential suspect, her behaviour is of course written to draw viewer suspicion, but her inappropriate behaviour towards the young boys of the village certainly raises an eyebrow. One infamous scene shows her nude, teasing a young boy, and is deliberately uncomfortable and disturbing. It's also an indictment of Patrizia's character, as, exiled to the south, she acts out her boredom in grotesque and inappropriate ways. She is the modern world, invading a traditional space, poisoning it and corrupting it just by her very presence. Having said that, there is also no doubt that putting a naked Barbara Boucher was also probably there to titillate cinema audiences and capture their attention, and attention it certainly did catch. The scene caused a scandal, and Fulci once again found himself in court, showing that the one time both the boy and Boucher are in the same frame, it was in fact a dwarf body double that was playing the boy, shot from behind. Patrizia is of course representative of the very thing from which the homicidal priest Don Alberto is attempting to save the children, preserving them in their supposed innocence through strangulation, drowning and suffocation. The irony, of course, is that these children are far from being the innocence that Don Alberto imagines. They peep on sex workers that visit from the city, they torment a mentally handicapped character, they dig up a child's grave, they smoke, they lie, and they commit any other number of sins against the church, all of which is a far cry from the soft-focused visions that Don Alberto experiences as he tumbles to his ultimate death in the film's climax. This dream sequence has often been misinterpreted as Don Alberto having paedophile tendencies, but this is quite frankly a misreading, and it negates the point of the film, even though it's actually quite understandable given what we know about abuse within the Catholic Church. But this is not a film about paedophilia. It is about how religion becomes corrupted by its own dogma, and whilst the village may appear religious on the surface, all prayers, confession and crucifixes, it is in fact anything but. The piety covers a seething ugliness in which outsiders, the witch, the mentally handicapped, are persecuted and set upon. And while Don Alberto may verbalise that liberalism and modern permissiveness are to blame for all of the evils in the world, it is he that commits the most hideous of acts in secret. These themes caused outrage when the film was released. A contemporary Italian newspaper criticised the film for what it called, quote, irritating, oversimplified attitudes, end quote, towards villagers, sex workers, the police, and even the mentally disabled, saying that the film lacked any real social or ideological engagement, a perspective that, quite frankly, is grossly unfair in retrospect. As for the Catholic Church, whilst there was no formal denunciation, the backlash from more conservative circles in Italy was swift and severe. Conservative newspapers condemned the film as blasphemous, sacrilegious, and deliberately provocative. The response was especially fierce in the south, where parts of the film had been shot, and where the film's portrayal of rural superstition and religious hypocrisy hits closest to home. Fulci himself remained unrepentant, saying in later interviews that the church had created a monster by fostering a culture of repression, superstition, and blind obedience, particularly in the south. He also criticised the way that the church idealised childhood as something sacred, while remaining complicit in the abuse and destruction of actual children. And whilst this film is far from being subtle in stating this perspective, it certainly expresses it incredibly clearly. For a film from the so-called godfather of gore, one might expect Duckling to be scene after scene of bloodshed, yet it is surprisingly restrained, which is no bad thing really, given its subject matter. Though modern audiences, coming from the later excesses of The Beyond or City of the Dead, may feel somewhat disappointed. The murders of the children, thankfully, happen largely off-screen or are judiciously edited, with the two standout gore moments instead reserved for adults. There is Don Alberto's fall from the cliff tops, a scene which today may raise as many smiles as it does winces, and which Fulci himself later replicated in the opening of 7 Notes in Black. And then there's also the brutal lynching of Florinda Balkan's character, Maciara, the local witch and outsider. This scene is, in my opinion, the most heartbreaking death of any giallo, combining brutality, tragedy, and social commentary. Balkan, who had worked with Fulci on Lizard in a Woman's Skin, gives a standout performance in this movie, and that's no small achievement, given that her character has very little dialogue and is in fact silent for pretty much the first third of the film. A local witch who has been outcast by the villagers, presumably due to her epilepsy being mistaken for demonic possession, she truly believes that her magic is responsible for the murders. It is this belief in her magic, which was born out of revenge against the boys who disturbed the grave of her stillborn baby, that leads to her confession and violent death at the hands of a lynch mob. Her walk through the village after being released by the police, with shutters being closed on her and people spitting as she passes, foreshadows what is to come, and it is one that the viewer observes with dread. Attacked by the fathers of the deceased boys, she is whipped with chains and beaten to death, all underscored by a sweet pop ballad playing on the radio. Crawling away, she dies alone at the side of the main road, as uncaring tourists pass by on the motorway, en route to a finer destination. Florinda Balkan said in later interviews that she couldn't bring herself to watch it for decades, and when she finally did, she wept. Not because of the violence, but because of the sheer emotional cruelty of it. Upon its Italian release in September 1972, the film encountered mixed to negative reviews from critics, even though it garnered respectable box office success. As well as the critiques mentioned earlier, many reviewers of the time were shocked by the film's subject matter. A thriller about child murders was virtually unheard of, and they tended to dismiss the movie as lurid exploitation. Noted critic Mirando Marandini savaged the film, writing that it, quote, follows the most cliché and despicable rules of the genre, dishonesty in the use of suspense, an abuse of gory details, handfuls of sadomasochism, free-for-all acting, and a contempt for logic, end quote. Overall, the film was treated as a crude piece of entertainment for an audience with very bad taste. But over the years, it has been reappraised, with even Morandini himself reconsidering the film in later editions of his film guide, admitting a somewhat improved rating of 2.5 stars out of 5, and acknowledging that the movie had merits beyond its more sensational elements. By the 1990s and 2000s, it came to be recognised as one of Fulci's greatest achievements, a cult classic lauded by horror aficionados and film scholars alike. For me, this film remains his most effective and most powerful piece of filmmaking. The House with Laughing Windows and Don't Torture a Duckling bookend a period of profound social transformation in post-war Italy. They both unfold in rural backwaters, very far from the chic cosmopolitan landscapes more typical of the Giallo, and both also share a fascination with communities on the edge, geographically, historically, and morally. What both films explore, each in their own way, is the Italy left behind during the great internal migration of the mid-20th century, bearing witness to what was abandoned, and the fear, secrecy, superstition, and resentment that festered and grew as a result. These aren't just murder mysteries, they're maps of a nation's fracture lines. Progress versus the past, north versus south, country versus town. And watching them side by side, that fracture becomes all too apparent. So that brings us to the end of another episode, and thank you again for listening. As always, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And please also consider sharing this with your friends. You can contact the show at thehorrordoublebill@gmail.com, and please remember to follow our Instagram, The Horror Double Bill, for additional extras and information. So next week we move away from mad killers and venture into the world of the supernatural, more specifically the worlds of conjure, witchcraft, and ceremonial magic, with 2 movies from screenwriter and nightmare maker Richard Matheson. First up, we have Night of the Eagle from 1962, which was released in the US as Burn Witch Burn. And then we move forward just a couple of years to The Devil Rides Out from 1968, starring Christopher Lee in, rather unusually, the heroic role. Both films are available to rent from a very well-known streaming provider, and Night of the Eagle is also available for rent on YouTube. So, I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion, and in the meantime, thank you again so much for listening, and have a really great week. Goodbye.